John, the Gospel of John, the 8th chapter, verse 5 through 11. What we're going to call it today for a title is Hypocrisy, Compassion, and Judgment. Because this is a verse that I think everybody pretty much knows. It's when they brought the woman who was caught in the very act of adultery before Jesus. But when we hear that and we talk about it, usually all people ever talk about is judging. But this verse has much more in it. It deals much more with hypocrisy, compassion, and a little bit of judgment. So we're going to look at this verse in its context first, and then we're going to look at what it means for us today. They brought this woman before Jesus to test him. Now the law of Moses commanded us to stone such a woman. So what do you say? They said this to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. And as they continued to ask him, he stood up and said to them, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." And once more he bent down and wrote on the ground. But when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones. And Jesus was left alone with a woman standing before him. Jesus stood up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, sin no more." This was a test because the law of Moses absolutely demanded that when people were caught in adultery, they be put to death. But it was a test because the nation of Israel, God's law was no longer the law of the land. It was Roman law. And Roman law did not give the Jews the right for the death penalty. So they thought they had Jesus caught. He can obey the law and say, "Stone her," and they can turn him into the Romans. Or he could say, "Let her go," and they could say he doesn't believe in the law. They thought they had the perfect plan. Well, first of all, that's the first act of hypocrisy. They weren't worried about God's law. They weren't worried about justice. They weren't worried about righteousness. They just wanted to get Jesus. Now, the second bit of hypocrisy there was the law was also very explicit. When people were caught in the act of adultery, both were to be stoned. Where is he? He's back at home. They caught her in the act. Well, guess what? That means they caught him too. And let him go. More hypocrisy. Now, as we look at this, we'll see what Jesus said. He said, oh, I'll solve the problem for you. Let the person who's without sin cast the first stone. Easy. Well, they knew they were hypocrites. They knew they had let him go. They knew that even without that, they were people who had sinned. But he was being very specific. Now he said, if you don't have any sin, go ahead. You see, the witnesses were supposed to throw the first stone. Those who saw the act. Well, go ahead. If you're not guilty, you do it too. He was showing compassion. Now, one thing that a lot of people miss is Jesus actually did judge her. And you go, what do you mean? Because he said, go and from this time forward, sin no more. That's a judgment. There's two types of judgment, and that's where we get confused. There is deciding whether or not something is right or wrong, or punishment. It is identifying wrongdoing or punishing wrongdoing. We have one English word that covers that, but it's actually two different things. He identified wrongdoing, because he couldn't say, go and sin no more, if he didn't know and judge that she had sinned. But then he said, go. He judged, but he did not condemn. Now, one of the first things, as we want to apply this today, because the lessons taught in this verse are so sadly lacking in our culture today in so many ways. First thing that we want to learn from this, I want you to turn to Galatians, the 5th chapter, and verse 19. Galatians 5, when you get there, verse 19. Now the works of the flesh are evident: sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality. It goes on, but that's what we need to talk about right now. Those are the works of the flesh. Guess what? Adultery is still wrong. Our world doesn't want to believe that, but adultery is still wrong. But more than that, and I think this is something that religious people have a problem with. All types of sexual immorality and impurity and sensuality are wrong. Adultery is wrong. Fornication is wrong. Premarital sex is wrong. And homosexuality is wrong. It's a sin. We have a problem in this world today is that we don't want to call sin sin. Jesus was very compassionate, but he wasn't afraid to call sin sin. I want you to, We're going to get back to this in the end because there's a real something that I want to deal with, but people today, even an ex-president, are saying, well, you know what? Jesus never said a thing about homosexuality. Well, I want you to turn to what Paul said in Romans, the first chapter. We're going to read verses 25, 26, and 27. Romans, first chapter, down in verse 25. Because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. For their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another. Men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. I want you to turn to 1 Corinthians 6. And verse 18. Flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body. Here, just to make sure I'm changing the order I'm saying things, so I've got to double check. Jesus lived under the Old Testament. He lived and he died under the law of Moses. The law of Moses absolutely forbade homosexuality. He didn't have to say a word about it. But he did say that not one jot or tittle from the law would pass away until it was all fulfilled. So yes, he did say something about homosexuality. Because he said the law, until it was fulfilled, which was on his death, was the law. So yes, he did. But even if he hadn't, Paul said that. I want you to turn to 1 Corinthians 14:37 right now. Just to bring something else up here. 37, excuse me. Can't read my own writing. Paul had been giving some teaching here, and in verse 37 he says, if anyone thinks he's a prophet or spiritual, he should acknowledge that the things I am writing to you are a command of the Lord. If anyone does not recognize this, he is not recognized. It's hypocrisy to separate Jesus from Paul and Peter and the other writers of the New Testament. And I don't care if you are a religious president of the United States or not. It's still hypocrisy and wrong. Jesus had compassion on the woman. He didn't whitewash her sin, but he said, don't do it anymore. He did not punish her. We need to understand that in the Old Testament, the law was not only the spiritual law, but was the physical law. We live in a country where we have the law of Christ in this congregation. We follow that law. But we also have a law that governs our physical being. But they're separate. In the Old Testament, they were not. The Old Testament has rules for religious living. It also tells you that if you build a house and do not put a fence around the roof, you're guilty if somebody falls off. It told you that you couldn't square the corners of your field. You had to leave that for the poor. If you were gathering your crop and you dropped some on the ground, you couldn't pick it up. It's a good thing we don't have to go back and separate what was the physical law from the religious law. We don't have to do that because that old law was nailed to the cross. We don't have to separate. But we do have to understand one thing. In the Old Testament, all law-breaking had a physical punishment. Whether it was not putting a fence around your roof or breaking the Sabbath or adultery or homosexuality. They all had a physical, worldly punishment. I want you to look now, and we're going to read this, Colossians 2, verse 14. The verse I mentioned, by canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands, this he set aside, nailing it to the cross. He disarmed the rulers and the authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them. But we do have a new spiritual law. We have the New Testament. But there's something about that that maybe we don't think about. I want you to turn back to the Gospel of John. And we're going to go to chapter 18 and verse 36. This is very important. When Jesus was on trial, he said, Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world. There is no physical punishment for sin in Jesus' kingdom. There is a spiritual punishment that will be delivered at the last day by the righteous judge. But that's not me, and that's not you. We had a man who calls himself a pastor. I'll call him an in-pastor, who suggested that the police round up homosexuals and execute them. Well, Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. Doesn't matter if it's a religious rule or not. The church has no business doing that. Period. End of quote. That man knows a lot about hypocrisy, but very little about compassion. And that's one thing that I get really upset about. I will tell you that homosexuality is wrong. It is. Go and sin no more. But so is premarital sex. You know what the punishment in the Old Testament was for premarital sex? Stoning. Oh, did you hear him calling to round up all the teens that are living in sin and shoot them? Well, no. Well, what about the people that commit adultery? Did you hear him calling for that? Hypocrisy is wrong, people. If you want to pull up the physical laws from the Old Testament, which Christ says don't, but if you want to do it, don't be a hypocrite and pick and choose what you don't like. Just a thought before we go. Jesus is almost always as compassionate and understanding with vile sinners as he was with that woman. The only time he gets down, mean, and nasty is when he calls the religious hypocrites of his day vipers and told them to get away from me. He told the other sinners, come, sin no more. But religious hypocrites, he has no use for. Brethren, we need to toe the line that Jesus gave us. We cannot excuse sin, but neither are we in the sin punishment business. We're in the sinner saving business. Amen. And that includes us. If anybody needs to answer the invitation in a public way, we ask you to come now.